Hi, my name is Christopher McKnight Nichols. I'm a historian here at Oregon State University, and I'm the director of OSU's Center for the Humanities. Today, I will be answering questions about World War I on the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I on November 11th, 1918. So, let's get started. Okay, here we go. First question. Is it true that World War I began because an Archduke was assassinated, because the car he was in took a wrong turn and just so happened to stumble in front of the assassin? This is a great question. Thanks for asking. So the first part of the question, it is true that an Archduke was assassinated, and that did precipitate the coming of the war. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was heir to the throne of the Habsburg Empire, and his assassination in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914 did begin the series of events that led the world into World War I. That said, what's interesting about this myth about the wrong turn and the assassin eating a sandwich and suddenly finding the Archduke there right in front of him is that it's very recent. It looks to historians like this account only began in the 21st century, roughly with some documentaries and some cartoon documentaries that you may have seen that came after it about 2003. And the idea here is that it's an embellishment of the real historical story. So what happened was Princip and a number of Bosnian-born Serbian nationalists wanted to assassinate the Archduke. They got weapons from the Serbian military intelligence. Many of these weapons were actually outdated, so the first person who threw a grenade at the car of the Archduke and his wife, the grenade didn't explode on time. It had a longer fuse than they expected, and it actually blew up, destroying the car that was behind the Archduke's vehicle. Those officers, many of them were injured and they were taken to the hospital. What happens as this day goes on, the actual historical account, is that the Archduke eventually, after seeing some people in town hall, decides to go to the hospital to visit those officers. His driver doesn't know the town of Sarajevo, winds up making several turns which take him back to the original route that he was supposed to travel. Well, of course, those who were advising him did not want that to happen, and he pauses in front of a delicatessen named Schiller's, where it just so happens that Gavrilo Princip, the man who winds up killing him, was waiting and talking to a friend. And so it was a coincidence that he was there, but it wasn't the story that's told more popularly now. What that story tends to miss is that there were these Serbian nationalists who were pushing for their own territorial sovereignty in this moment, and that there were lots of roiling new kinds of nationalism under the surface, peoples and groups trying to get out from under the oppression of empires that were ruling them. And so if we just take this story as one of coincidence and assassination that leads to war, we forget the fact that there were lots and lots of people trying to get out from under the heel of these empires. And one of the consequences of the war is that 4 empires fall: the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, the German Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And this is one of the big consequences of the conflict. So when we just chalk it up to coincidence, we miss something really significant. All right, let's move on to our next question. Okay. Why was World War I called the Great War, and was it truly a world war? So this is a crucial kind of question, I think, in understanding World War I. Why was it called a Great War? Well, the most obvious ways in which it was a great war were also the ways in which it was global. It was the most catastrophic war in human history in total casualties to that point. The use of modern industrial mechanized means of warfare, from weapons, machine guns, the advent of flamethrowers, tanks, airplanes, sea battles, U-boats, made this conflict something that seemed fundamentally modern. And to most observers at the time, fundamentally modern in terms of war was absolutely bad. So what made it so great in some ways in the memory of those who've written about it afterwards was that its greatness was measured by the so-called lost generation of human beings who were either killed or were terrible casualties, or on the war front were casualties because they had on the home front, there were casualties because they had known those who had lost lives and suffered in the conflict. We still live in the shadow of World War I. So what was the lasting effect of the war after the conflict ended on a global scale? There are a number of lasting effects of the war. The first is that 4 empires crumble in the context of the war. So you've got Russia collapsing, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. What happens there is that you have, at the Paris Peace Conference, 1918 and 1919, those empires, as well as the French, the British, the rising Japanese, and others, want to carve up the previous colonial empires of the losing powers in the war. So of the consequences of that conflict, a number of things come out of it. There's a province in China called Shandong that was first annexed by the Germans, from the Germans by the Japanese in the course of the war, then gets given back to the Japanese. It becomes hotly contested through the 20s and 30s. It becomes one of the primary places. This port is part of Manchuria, where then the Second World War begins to be formed. And the Sino-Japanese wars of the 1930s arise out of that area. So what were the major differences between World War I and World War II, or were they basically just one huge war? Well, this is a great question. Books have been written on this subject. I can't do it justice. My argument would be that they're linked, that there are causes that are very similar and consequences that are global and reshaping out of both wars, but that fundamentally they are not just one big war. And I think maybe the best way of understanding this comes in two parts. One comes from here, from the US. The US role in World War I was relatively insignificant. Very few troops were committed abroad. The majority of US troops who were casualties were non-combat, non-battlefield casualties. Many died of the great influenza epidemic of 1918. And the US mustered its troops so late that it barely fought, though it fought honorably and well in the conflict. Whereas in World War II, the US fought, suffered, and died in significant numbers, not as much as nowhere near the Russian armies. But the US had a much bigger ultimate stake in World War II. The second thing that's different is the language of it. And I think this is a misperception that a lot of us have today. Very frequently my students will just import in the language of World War II to the parties in World War I, the Allies, they'll say an Axis. There were no Allies, there was no Axis in World War I. That's language from World War II. That's the Axis was Italy, was Japan, and was Germany, and they were fascist dictatorial regimes. Whereas in World War I, the central powers were Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, and they were coming out of much longer monarchical, aristocratic traditions, and they were just hanging on to power in this area in some ways. Whereas if you think about World War II, you had rising powers of fascist regimes like Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan bent on taking over the whole Pacific as well. So there are significant differences, and I think the one other thing we should think about that explains why it's not just one long war is what happened in the 20s and 30s. That is, there was a really robust international movement for peace, led by people from all the different combatant nations of World War I. They pushed hard for the League of Nations, for an array of treaties, arms limitations, and other ways of keeping the peace in the world system. And then there's the Great Depression, which changed the structure of governance in lots of countries and really precipitated a kind of a global crisis that eventually did lead to the war, but led to World War II in very different ways from what was happening between, say, 1900 and 1914. All right, we're finally in Oregon with OSU. All right, so how was OSU affected by World War I? This is a great question. OSU was profoundly affected by World War I. OSU students, faculty, and staff, roughly 2,000, including alumni, served in the war. Something on the order of 44,000 served out of the state of Oregon. OSU's various activities on campus were shut down. There was a dorm facility that was for quarantining people with the influenza epidemic so it wouldn't get any worse, and reportedly that was a very effective strategy here at OSU. In fact, OSU wasn't even called OSU during the war. It was Oregon Agricultural College, OAC. One of the most famous war heroes in US history to come out of World War I was Ulysses McAlexander, for whom a field house here is named. He was called the so-called Rock of the Marne, was the name that he got out of a battle, the Battle of the Marne, where his troops were pinned down. The French troops pull back. There's a large German assault, and his troops are able to hold their territory against overwhelming numbers. His war herodom was a tradition that's been carried on up to the present in the ROTC at OSU, and also is why his division, the 38th Infantry, was named the Marne Division. It still is when it goes out in the US and in the world. So those are some of the effects. I think one other thing that's interesting to note in the wartime context that we don't often think about was the war in Europe brought recession to Oregon. Oregon's timber industry, Oregon's agriculture were profoundly hurt in 1914 when there was a global war aborning. And throughout the course of the conflict, there was a recession throughout the U.S., and particularly in agricultural parts of the U.S. So in the American South, the cotton producers were hit particularly hard in 1914 and 1915. Obviously, industry that wasn't involved in war making was hit. And so that's another piece of this story. In Oregon, lots of people were out of work. There wasn't as much industry, but coming immediately out of the conflict, 1919 and thereafter, industry revs up. So you get an OAC that gets lots more students in after the conflict, and you get a state economy that begins to get humming again. So I have with me here A School for the People, Larry Landis's book about the history of Oregon. And I thought it would be useful for us to consider for a moment the World War I experience here at Oregon Agricultural College, Oregon State University. And in particular, he cites a document, the 1918-1920 College Biennial Report by college editor Edwin Reed, who wrote that the war at OAC, like at other land-grant universities, was so involved and to such an extent, quote, as to be a dominant interest even before the declaration of war and long after the signing of the armistice. So even before April 1917 and long after November 1918, World War I was really a dominant part of what was going on at Oregon Agricultural College. From housing students in the Army Training Corps, he argues, to a Liberty Loan drive to raise money for the war, which netted $83,000 towards the war effort, OAC was a big part of it. Another piece of that he talks about in this biennial report and in this book is that Oregon agricultural faculty helped increase production of wheat and other grains to get out to troops in the fields. And that a host of other parts of the physical plant of Oregon Agricultural College were dedicated only to the war effort during this period. So that's one of the significant ways in which the war impacted OAC/OSU. Thank you for having me. It's been great to be here with you talking about World War I, talking about World War I's global consequences and influence, and considering the ways in which Oregon Agricultural College, Oregon State University, and the state of Oregon were part of that process.